And let's bring you the latest from Singapore, where Prime Minister Modi is holding an informal breakfast for the members of the ASEAN. And today, as we all know, is the day when the South Asia Summit is all set to take place. These are live visuals coming in from Singapore. As we all know, this is indeed a big day for Prime Minister Modi. Yesterday, Prime Minister met the Vice President of the United States, Modi-Pence. And today, the Prime Minister is holding an informal breakfast for the members of the ASEAN Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you, friends. Thank you.
It was during yesterday's meeting with Vice President of the United States, Modi-Pence, that terror attacks also were discussed between India and US. The Prime Minister also said that he was confident that his visit to Singapore would impart fresh momentum to New Delhi's growing partnership with ASEAN and East Asia Summit nations. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had pitched India as a favorite destination for investment and financial inclusion. At the FinTech Summit, which also took place yesterday, he delivered the keynote address at the Singapore FinTech Summit, where he talked about the growing need for a digital economy in India. And it will be today that 18 countries will be meeting at the South Asia Summit, which will also address China's growing might in the South Pacific region. This summit will later be followed by a meeting of the Quad that includes countries like India, Japan, Australia and the United States. And to bring us more details on the South Asia Summit that is all set to take place, prior to that, the informal breakfast being hosted by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. To add more perspective on the latest developments, I'm joined in by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who joins me live from the newsroom. Let's quickly go across to Siddhant. Siddhant, a very good morning to you. This is indeed a very hectic day for the Prime Minister, because not only is he hosting the ASEAN nations for breakfast, but he's also going to follow that up with a meeting of the Quad.
Well, today is a very hectic day in Singapore for the Indian Prime Minister. The breakfast meeting between ASEAN and India has started. This is kind of an informal meeting which is taking place. This time there is no official India-ASEAN summit, which usually takes place on the sidelines of the East Asian Summit, because remember, it has already happened earlier this year when all the 10 heads of ASEAN's leaders were here in New Delhi for the Republic Day parade, and after that there was this summit, and that is why there is no official ASEAN-India summit taking place. But of course, informal meeting, you can say, on the sidelines of that breakfast meeting taking place. But other than that, two main important things are going to take place. One, of course, is the lunch retreat of the East Asian Summit. That's the 13th East Asian Summit. And then, of course, the formal summit, the 13th East Asian Summit that will take place. And then, of course, the Indian Prime Minister will be back in New Delhi. East Asian Summit, of course, focusing on ASEAN, the other countries like Australia, Japan, US, China, which are also part of the East Asian Summit, and focus will be on many things, whether it's connectivity, whether it's geopolitics, or whether it's following the rule of law in the entire region.
Right.
But on the sidelines, of course, the Quad is going to take place.
Absolutely, Siddhant very rightly mentioned that on the sidelines it will be the Quad meeting, which will of course be not a summit but an informal meeting. Coming to, the security cooperation in the South Pacific region, which will of course also be addressed during this meeting of, as you said, during the East Asia Summit. What can we expect when it comes to China's growing might? Will that be an issue that will be raised?
Well, China is the dragon or the elephant in the room, and that is something that is bound to be discussed during the Quad meeting. Well, Quad is an informal grouping. As of now, it's a format in which India, Japan, US and Australia is involved. This is the second time the Quad meeting is going to take place this year. It was revived last year, and of course this is causing some worry in Beijing, because every time Quad is revived, Beijing thinks it's containment of Beijing in the entire Asian region, and we have seen how Indo-Pacific as a concept is also gaining currency in the entire region. India and US, of course, the bookends of the entire Indo-Pacific concept, which is gaining currency, and this time also that will be the main focus when the leaders meet on this for the 13th East Asian Summit. So clearly China thinks as a containment, and of course China's rise is not a very peaceful rise. We have seen how skirmishes not only with India, which happened with Doklam, but rest of the Asian countries, whether it's ASEAN. Remember, you just spoke about the crisis in the other part of the world, of course, the Pacific region. But other than that, of course, focus will be on how to build camaraderie also, because remember, you can't ignore China. It's the fastest growing economy, and it's contributing majorly to the world economics.
Absolutely, Siddhant. And, also run us through what is it over here that Prime Minister Modi can take away from all these summits. It's, of course, been very important for Prime Minister Modi, this visit, because he's also he's hosting the breakfast today. He was the first head of nation to have addressed the FinTech summit that happened yesterday. What is it for India that can be actually a key takeaway from all these summits that are going to take place in Singapore?
Well, the key takeaway is growing connectivity between India and its East Asian neighbors. Remember, it was during the East Asian Summit in 2014 that the Indian Prime Minister talked about Act East policy, which is now the cornerstone of Narendra Modi government, and one of the focus areas in the Act East policy is connectivity. India right now is working on two major projects with ASEAN. One, of course, is the Kaladan multimodal project, and another is the trilateral highway between India, Thailand and Myanmar, which of course is expected to be extended till Vietnam. So these are the two focus area which India will be focusing on, and these are the two takeaways which India will be talking about when it meets the ASEAN leaders during the breakfast meet, which is already started. But other than that, the focus will be on developing a common thought process over global issues, whether it's counter-terror, whether it's freedom of navigation. We have seen the Indian Prime Minister also bilaterally trying to grow relationship with countries in the ASEAN. He visited Indonesia just few months ago, in which a connectivity plan has been developed between the Andaman Islands and Sumatra province of Indonesia. Other than that, the Indian Prime Minister, this is Indian Prime Minister's second visit to Singapore this year. Earlier this year, when he visited Singapore, he of course spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue, from which he talked about what New Delhi thinks about the entire Indo-Pacific concept, a concept which New Delhi has been saying it's an inclusive concept. It's not trying to alienate something, which of course China obviously believes so, that is trying to alienate. And China is one of the few countries, and of course the only major country, that is still using the word Asia Pacific, unlike the other countries in which the focus is on Indo-Pacific. So these are the key takeaways on building a common thought process, convergence on major issues across the world. And we know this area, the entire Indo-Pacific region, will be the cornerstone of the world security architecture in next few years, or perhaps next 100 years.
Absolutely. As you just rightly mentioned that, the Indo-Pacific security architecture is going to define a lot of defense mechanism in the years to come. You must run our viewers through that.
Well, of course, Indo-Pacific is a new concept. This, of course, was elaborated or put in place by United States and India. And many, of course, believe that China will be on the receiving end of it. But that's not the case. This is the concept in which India and US are the two bookends. And the focus is on common things like democracy and, of course, freedom of navigation. That is something that is a cause of worry in the entire region because of the crisis in the South China Sea, because that is something that has been causing trouble between China and rest of the ASEAN countries. Remember that 9-dash line is a cause of concern because that effectively puts the entire South China Sea into China's hands. So that is a cause of worry, and a lot of shipping and trade happens through South China Sea. So that is something that is one of the key pillars of the entire concept. But by and large, this concept is also on economics, on business, on how business can be grown in the entire region, in Indo-Pacific region, because lot of trade happens through this region, especially to the Malacca Straits, which of course connects the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. And now India has also changed its thinking when it comes to its neighbors. No longer New Delhi considers geographically the landmass as its neighbors. Like if we look at through landmass, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan are our neighbors, but India considers its neighbors through, of course, its oceans, through Indian Ocean. So India does consider South Africa its neighbor because of the connectivity through the Indian Ocean. So that is the new thought process that has developed in New Delhi, and that, of course, the Indian Prime Minister has been trying to elaborate many times and will be, of course, elaborating at the East Asian Summit that will, of course, begin today.
Right. Siddhant, you very rightly mentioned the importance of trade during this entire summit. And we all know what an active role Mr. Suresh Prabhu, India's Minister of Commerce and Industry, has been playing during this summit, since everybody, the media also focused on Mr. Prabhu's presence yesterday. Having said that, we also know of, this entire summit taking place in the backdrop of the ongoing US-China trade war, and India had, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi had an informal meeting with US Vice President Modi-Pence. So what is it that India can take away in terms of trade? Because India and America also are at a very tricky juncture at the moment in terms of trade.
Well, of course, trade is something that is bound to be the main focus of every summit that takes place. And as you just mentioned about, first, of course, the meeting between the Indian Prime Minister and the American Vice President Modi-Pence, the focus, of course, was trade. There was a readout by the White House which said that Modi-Pence focused on fair, free and reciprocal trade between New Delhi and Washington. That will be the focus. But globally, if we look at how America is changing its policies, the focus area is how to reduce trade deficit. India, of course, has been reiterating to the American administration that not only trade deficit has reduced with the Americans, but also India in last 2 years has increased its imports from the Americans by 50%. That, of course, is something that India expects the American administration to take note of. But will it make Donald Trump happy? That's a question which only time will tell. Only a day before yesterday, when the Diwali celebrations took place in the White House, Donald Trump did mention about the trade deal which New Delhi and Washington has been trying to hammer out. But he also was a little bit cautious on the entire aspect. Of course, New Delhi has been very quiet about the expected trade deal. There has been no mention about this trade deal by any minister in New Delhi. But of course, the Americans have been talking about it. US President, of course, saying about it many times, of course, calling India as a tariff king also. But with respect to China, the situation is much more worrisome when it comes to relationship, especially on trade. We have seen how both the countries have put trade tariffs on each other on so many goods, and there doesn't seem to be an end to it. But by and large, as of now, New Delhi and Washington are trying to at least make sure that publicly, at least on photo ops, and the statements made by both sides are like, in a sense, good, and that, of course, is a departure in a sense, because the media report does say that all might not be well, especially on two counts. One, of course, the recent reports that the US president was invited for the Republic Day parade as a guest, but New Delhi, of course, saying that this was a generic invite and he was invited anytime. He is invited anytime. Other, of course, is the fact that the S-400 deal between India and Russia is a cause of worry in Washington. There, of course, no decision has been made on these sanctions under the CAATSA regime, but we do expect any decision by the end of this year. So these are the two things that is a cause of worry between India and Washington. Though the Vice President of United States met the Indian Prime Minister, there will be another meeting, though it's not confirmed, but it's likely to happen between the Indian Prime Minister and the US President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G20 summit that will take place on November 30th and December 1st in Argentina.
Absolutely, Siddhant, and you rightly mentioned that it is a very, very tricky situation for India to maintain that balance in terms of trade relations, not just with US but also with the Russia. So that's also a part of a section of media was also commenting on what Mike Pence's role could be in terms of his presence vis-a-vis with Indian relations, because that's what media reports suggested, that he could have just been there to squeeze India out of choosing Russia over the United States. Is that what we can expect from the American presence at the summit?
Well, of course, the American presence and the American meet with the Indian leadership obviously focuses on these aspects. Obviously, they will not like the growing closeness between India and Russia, but Russia has been a long-standing partner of New Delhi, and New Delhi can't ditch Russia just like overnight. So, of course, New Delhi will continue to balance its relationship between Moscow and Washington. But by and large, if you look at the photo ops, if you look at the comments, if you look at the bites, and of course the readouts from the White House, both New Delhi and Washington are trying to assuage the entire concerns. Of course, the media reports, as you just mentioned, but by and large, this is a relationship which is developing. India is, of course, trying to make sure that the Trump administration is not miffed, because he is a president there's a departure in the policies, and of course, India is the only closest partner as of now, because there is still positive views about the US President Donald Trump here in New Delhi. But if you look at the rest of the world, it's not so positive. We recently saw what happened in Paris. He came from Paris and he was tweeting about the French President Macron, and of course with China also relationship is not very good. So clearly New Delhi is still on a better footing, given the fact that with other countries Donald Trump is not facing such a good and rosy picture. But more than New Delhi, Washington needs New Delhi in the region and in the world as an ally, given the fact that China is another country in the region, which of course Washington definitely doesn't like but can't ignore. So that is why Washington needs New Delhi, and of course will continue to support New Delhi, even though New Delhi is not getting as much from Washington as it should have got.
Right. Siddhant, also very important to highlight the other key global issues that might be addressed during the East Asia Summit. That also includes the Rohingya crisis being one of them.
Well, of course, that's an issue that has been on the global forefront for many years now. Of course, now there has been a deal which has been hammered out between Bangladesh and Myanmar. But Dhaka has been saying for a long time that Myanmar might just ditch it. It's not very serious about the entire deal. But recently there were comments from the Chinese Foreign Ministry lauding the deal and saying that Myanmar is doing its level best. India also has a major role in the entire crisis. India, of course, has been sending a lot of relief and relief measure to Myanmar, and of course building makeshift homes in the Rakhine province. But other than these cosmetic actions, there has to be a ground level support also, because this can be a major issue for the entire region, especially for the South Asian region, because leaders have been saying that it can be a cause of worry, it can be a cause of radicalization in the South Asian region, a cause that if we if we elongate into the major crisis of the issue of terrorism, it can be a good substratum for the for recruiters, for terrorist recruiters. So that is something that, of course, has been on the forefront whenever Asian leaders have been meeting. Yesterday, Mike Pence met Aung San Suu Kyi, and of course, she also have been on the receiving end. But largely, that's the issue that will dominate when the leaders meet on the for the East Asian Summit. But the other issue that is going to be highlighted is the issue of terror, because that is an issue that has been garnering all the attention globally. And yesterday, when the Indian Prime Minister met the American Vice President, the focus was also on this issue, the issue of terror, especially terror coming from Islamabad.